flagship event, Global Strategic Threat Response GSTAR 2022. Ladies and gentlemen, the second session of GSTAR is titled Geoeconomics, Driver of the Asian Century. The conventional wisdom of the 21st century as being a decidedly Asian century corresponds with various tectonic shifts in the geoeconomics of the Asia-Pacific region. These shifts portend an increasing concentration of economic development and dynamism in Asia, but are accompanied by strategic level recalibrations of the world's major geoeconomic players in ways that are at times complementary, but at other times antagonistic. This GSTAR session looks at three core elements of geoeconomic concern in the Asian century and what they might mean for Pakistan and the whole world as on large. The three core elements are as follows. 1. The impact of great power rivalry in Asia-Pacific. 2. The geoeconomics of Asia-Pacific's rise. And 3. How to build peaceful regional connectivity and prosperity. Looking at these three facets of contemporary geoeconomics and drawing upon the insights of leading international thinkers, this session will offer a significant contribution to our understanding of the role that geoeconomics will play in the modern geostrategic environment. The moderator of the second session is Dr. Usman Chauhan, who is Director Economics and National Affairs Development at Center for Aerospace and Security Studies. He is among the top 10 business authors out of 12,000 authors on the Social Science Network, which is the largest open repository in the world. He has published 4 books in the past 4 years. 1. Public Value and Budgeting, International Perspectives. 2. Reimagining Public Managers, Delivering Public Value. 3. Public Value and Digital Economy. 4th, Pandemics and Public Value Management. In the academic realm, his research has been cited widely, as for example in the World Trade Organization, the European Parliament, the National Bureau of Economic Research, IEEE, and the OECD, among many others. And Dr. Chauhan has testified before various authorities based on his technical expertise. Dr. Chauhan's forthcoming 5th book is titled Activist Retail Investors and the Future of Financial Market, while his forthcoming 6th book is titled Public Value and the Post-Pandemic Society. So without any further delay, I would request the session moderator to take over the proceedings.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Honored guests, excellencies, foreign representatives, members of the civil and bureaucracy, military officials, Muid Yusuf Saab, my esteemed panelists both here and online, our large viewership on YouTube, and those tuning in via Zoom, Assalamu alaikum. It is my supreme pleasure to welcome you all to the second session of GSTAR 2022. This one is about geoeconomics. It is something that I have been thinking about very deeply for a long time, and I have assembled the best people online and in person to guide our understanding of the subject. We will see from a multifaceted perspective what geoeconomics is and what it might be. I'm actually a double agent today because I'm not just moderator, I'm laying the groundwork for what I think we should talk about. I would request my slides, please, so that we can come to a common general understanding of the contours of geoeconomics. So, a stellar panel, as you have seen all over the signboards and placards, with different perspectives. What I want to get to is what is geoeconomics as I would interpret it. And then others will give you better definitions and understandings. Why is geoeconomics an orphaned subject? Have you ever met somebody who calls themselves a geoeconomist? I mean, for so long I have been working on this subject, but I wouldn't tell you I'm a geoeconomist. Why? What does it mean? Why is it important for us? And then what I perceive as a great realignment. Okay, this is where session 2 and session 1 may have divergence of opinions considerably. Geoeconomics is taking your strategic worldview and your economic interests and sublimating them into common objectives. Okay, so that seems pretty easy to do, but you'd be surprised, not everybody's very good at it. Part of the reason is because it is an orphan subject. So your IR specialists look at economics in a cursory manner, non-expert manner, but the economists are worse because they don't believe that your strategic interests and your economic interests should be one and the same, because the state should not be interfering in the market, or the market should not be driving what the state cares about. So there's an ideological gap, and yet it is very important. So if it is an orphaned subject, then some people do it well and some people don't. If I look at this map of the outlines of countries, I would tell you that China does it very well, because they have a special relationship between the state and the market. Their largest juggernauts are state-owned enterprises. So they can find a common alignment between what is market-driven interests, as insofar as they may be defined, and the state-driven objective. So it's done. Russia does this very well too. But they also have an interesting relationship between the state and the market, because in an oligarchic structure, those meld into a kind of uniform pattern. And Russia has used aggressively, offensively, and defensively its geoeconomics, some of which we have seen in 2022. Iran is another example, but it's also a weird exception if you think about it, because it is a country under immense strain and sanctions. So whatever the market can accomplish has to be done with the benevolence of the state. Now, are regular countries or countries in normal peacetime conditions comparable to this? Maybe, maybe not. I'll give you another example. India has great aspirations to be a geoeconomics player, but it does it very poorly. I'll give you 2 examples. Nepal, they had used the geoeconomic approach and they basically suffocated the country and still didn't get what they wanted. Another example, in Afghanistan, they tried to put in all this money, and what did they have to show for it at the end of the day? So they aspire to do that, but they're not very good at it. And then there is the United States, where, as I had mentioned, the ideological barrier, the state and the market, you basically have 2 opposing capitals which follow different logics. You have the New York community and you have the Washington community. And for the last 35 years, the economic community had pushed harder. They said Peking would fall into a similar pattern to Seoul and Taipei, that you go for the economics first and then you'll get your strategic stuff. But the strategic folks in Washington said, okay, you've had 35 years and it's not happening. So now it's our turn to dictate things. Now, that makes it seem as if having a uniform state-market relationship is a good thing, because if you have a diversity of opinions, you get clouded judgments, the community is fine. But there's a counter-argument there too. The counter-argument is that if you are all on one page, you could all be on the wrong page. So it's actually good to have a diversity of opinion. Maybe New York people are right for something and Washington are right for something. So you can argue it either way, but as far as geoeconomics goes, a state-market relationship has to be formed where they come to mutual understandings, otherwise they follow different logics. This is a slide particularly for the foreign participants and observers and speakers, that in the 4 movements that have happened since 1945 that are most important, Pakistan has played a very important role, but that role was driven largely by a strategic calculus. Economics played second fiddle to that. Decolonization, it was a moral case to do it. We were liberators of countries from A to Z, from Algeria to Zimbabwe. You didn't get any economic benefits from that per se. Similarly, the Cold War, there was a strategic logic, but the economy didn't aside from like foreign aid and stuff, which is not really a good thing in the long run, you didn't gain much from that. The war on terror, we are still paying the price for that. The economics of that, it's a very heavy legacy, and maybe it'll take a generation or two to wash that burden and that trauma. And what they call Cold War II, I don't like this terminology, but in this new confrontation, can it be different? Dr. Mueid Yusuf has been instrumental in arguing that we need to have a geoeconomics component. It should take primacy, or it should be at least as important as geostrategy, and so maybe this next episode will be different, and he can guide our understanding on that. But what you see because of that is that you have sort of opposing logics within societies, especially something like the United States, but even us. And so if you look at this map, if you have two superpowers on the left and right, there are some countries that have very clear strategic plus economic alignment. Russia is very much into China, particularly after 2022. Iran, it really at the $400 billion deal they signed with China. I mean, it's very clear that strategic and economic that side. India is it's getting greater clarity because it does have a healthy trade balance with China, or a large trading relationship with China, but its interests are very much in the US camp. The problem is everybody else is having a very hard time. For example, Australia has a very strong economic relationship with China, but its strategic and defense interests are entirely with the United States. And we are, to some extent, a mirror image of that, because our largest importing partner is the United States. It's a very large trading relationship, but our defense inclination is China plus the United States. So, and the same can be said for Canada on the Australian side. So a lot of prosperity created by cooperating with China economically, but defense, it's just natural that they would have an affinity with the United States. Singapore is a great example where it's benefited from both sides, and it wouldn't want to make this choice. Nobody would want to make this choice. But the balance between strategic and economic is really what we're talking about. These choices aren't easy, and as the first session, the very articulate speakers covered, nobody wants to make this choice. They're arguing they don't want to force, the powers say that they don't want to force this choice, but it's in the background. You can't really, gloss over it. Ideally, nobody would have to make these choices, but just remember that in this period, a century ago, so as the second quarter of the 20th century was beginning, there were lots of realignments happening. Some regretted it, some gained disproportionately from it, and so history will be the judge. I don't think it's very good for anybody to be forced to choose sides, personally. Now, the problem is that it's very hard to think long-term like this when your society, as well as all other societies, go through sequences of crises, and it appears, at least viscerally, that the kinds of crises occurring in the world are accelerating. We've had 4 crises in 4 years, and we've done a good job resolving them or moving past them. For example, in 2019, there was the India-Pakistan standoff, and it was the Pakistan Air Force that excelled in its duties, neutralized the target, captured a pilot, gave it back as an act of mercy. Crisis solved, but that could have been a very big deal. 2020 was the COVID-19 pandemic. Oh, that was terrible, but again, Pakistan did an extremely good job because of a multi-stakeholder effort. Everybody is cooperating, civil society, political, bureaucratic. It's a remarkable job, thank God. 2021, the fall of Kabul, it could have been really, really messy, but I'm glad that there's not millions of refugees on our streets right now, but you never, and then we have the floods in 2022. So when you are firefighting non-stop, you kind of lose sight of the big picture. We in think tanks are privileged to have a little bit of that calm, but we are always also keeping attuned to the urgent as opposed to the important. Okay. The thing is, we're not the only victims here. I don't want to play the victim here. The problem is that the world is in a big crisis, series of crises, and it has a very big intergenerational impact, which is why I've invited Professor Moore, who is an expert on intergenerational aspects, to comment on it too. In this meme, Gen Z is now bracing for a global recession. The writing is on the wall. We're expecting something bad to happen. It's very rational to be afraid. And then us millennials, which are people in their 30s, approaching 40, we say, oh, is it your first time? I mean, I joined equity finance in 2008, 6 months before Lehman collapsed. I've seen the whole thing. It's, so if this is the kind of aggression that the mind has to deal with, then you can't deal with sobriety with the complexity. And the truth is that even the people in charge everywhere are not doing a very good job. The best they can do for you is tell you, instead of a recession, that it's a growth stage, it's a transition without much growth. That's how they're dancing around the issues. So global leadership does not assure the youth of today in any country. So in a shattered world, or shattering world, how do we find the compassion and lucid thinking to have geoeconomics, trade, cooperation, integration take primacy again? And the people who are paranoid or the people who are a little jittery have reason to be so. And I think that as new generations come to the fore, they need to somehow keep that sang-froid to be able to make this world a better place, and cooperation is the answer. That's my sort of background for it. Now let's get the real stuff. I will first invite our keynote speaker, Dr. Mueed Yusuf, to give his vision for geoeconomics. He has been a strong advocate of this. Dr. Mueed Yusuf is our national security advisor. He is somebody I deeply admire personally. I think that what Pakistan needs in the end is more of Mueed Yusuf. This kind of intellectual enterprise that he has undertaken is something that I'm very grateful for as a Pakistani, as an ordinary citizen. And he has been a proponent of geoeconomics, and he has a particular vision that he will articulate, and I think it is something definitely for us to think about. And he, Dr. Mueed, will take, because he has to leave, he will take the questions after he speaks, and then we will resume the remainder of the panel, which is also very rich. Dr. Mueed, please.
Assalamu alaikum. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. First of all, thank you to the organizers, Usman, Marshal Farad, Cass. I have to say, and you said I am the National Security Advisor. Thankfully not. Thankfully not. I was. But I have to say, in our system, the National Security Advisor oversees a board which consists of various think tanks. And just to put it on record and congratulate Cass again, I always felt that by far the think tank that came up quicker than others and was perhaps most productive in terms of our work at the NSA's office was Cass. So congratulations to all of you. Geoeconomics. Usman, I want to be clear, everybody knows it's not my concept. It's Pakistan's national security policy that essentially talks about the way forward for the country when it comes to a broadened definition of national security. We won't go into what that particular policy document says, but one of its critical elements is defining economic security as the core of Pakistan's national security going forward. For Pakistan, this is a major statement, both internally for our domestic audience, but also for the world. And within economic security, one subset that we focus on is geoeconomics. Now, geoeconomics is a term that's it was coined after the Cold War, it's contested, it's debated, but there was a real reason to put geoeconomics in there as one of the subsets of economic security. And that is that the term too often has been used to convey a competition among states using the economic sphere to substitute for the strategic sphere. In our case, if you read our national security policy and virtually everything that we thought through when this policy was coming together, how do we benefit from the positive attributes of geoeconomics using our location to gain economically? That's the starting point. The term geo, and the reason, Usman, nobody talks about geoeconomics is that all of you talk about economics without thinking of geography. And in Pakistan's case, this concept of geoeconomics is really talking about how you shift your emphasis from using our location for geostrategic purposes to using it for geoeconomic purposes. So there's been a lot of conversation, and I've been asked a lot of times, have you given up on geostrategy? So my starting point for everybody is that geostrategy and geoeconomics are essentially two sides of the same coin. All you are doing is talking about how you approach a problem, and whether you give primacy to economic concerns and economic security when making a decision. So if you've got to shut down a border because of a security incident, Do you shut it down because you feel that it is most important to signal that there will be no other terrorism coming from across the border? Or do you find a way where you deal with that problem while ensuring that your trade and transit continues? That's essentially it. That's fundamentally the difference of approach between geostrategy and geoeconomics. Unfortunately, a lot of the debate in Pakistan so far has been about whether it's the right term to use, should there be another term, how do we square the circle of security and geoeconomy. My point is it's all irrelevant. You can use whatever term you want. Since the state has used the term geoeconomics, we stick to that. And the conception of where we want to go with this is very simple. And let me just explain that to you. We have two fundamental pillars when we talk about geoeconomics in Pakistan's context. First is connectivity. How does Pakistan become the connectivity hub for the broader region and gain in the process? Second, how do we move from a model of assistance partnerships to development partnerships? These two elements will determine whether we get anywhere close to economic security as a country, or whether we keep going in circles and debating what geoeconomics ultimately means for Pakistan. Now, let me unpack both of these. To say one very, very provocative thing to all of you. We are nowhere near where we need to be to benefit from this conception of geoeconomics. The conception of geoeconomics does not depict Pakistan's reality today. It provides you the direction and aspiration of where we should end up as a country, where our investments should go, where our productive time should be spent. So let me explain. Let's take the connectivity part. We've got 5 neighbors, 4 land and 1 sea. We're a country that has 2 of its western neighbors that are internationally sanctioned and largely isolated. We've got an eastern neighbor that we've had an acrimonious relationship with for 75 years. And we've got sea to the south, where our maritime economy really hasn't taken off. So what you're left with is China in the north, where I think it is a success story. We have developed connectivity, not only CPEC, but for the past 40 years, we've invested in that connectivity. A lot of investment has come into Pakistan, and we've generated momentum in terms of infrastructure and energy, which is essentially the prerequisite to move towards industrialization, manufacturing, agriculture, etc., which is the goal moving forward. But the other 4 borders essentially hold back any promise of connectivity. So if we are talking of geoeconomics and connectivity, we have to find ways to move in that direction in a very, very constrained environment. We can't as a country wait for things to change around us and then decide how we're going to benefit from this. And so, to be very perhaps controversial, and this is not a statement that I had or would make if I were in office, but this is just my analysis and I want to put it out. In one line, Pakistan has to think whether we can shift the regional conversation from dependence to interdependence. That's it. Can we make countries of the broader region interdependent with Pakistan's economic fortunes? If we can do that, we will find ways to benefit from geoeconomics. If we can't, we will, ladies and gentlemen, become a proxy of the great power competition that is going to play out around our borders for the next 20, 30, 40 years. We don't have a choice of being neutral and hiding in this. Our only choice is to be proactive and find ways to create such dependence of other countries on us that undermining Pakistan becomes a costly affair. Let me give you a few examples of how this may be possible. Afghanistan is a conduit to Central Asia. Pakistan has actually signed or is in the process of signing more agreements with Central Asian countries in the past 2 or 3 years than we had in the past 70 years. What's the reason? Because if we can get Central Asia and Eurasia to use our warm waters, we not only gain in terms of transit and economic monetary benefits from that, but we have now made much of Central Asia and Eurasia dependent on stability of that physical corridor that takes trade down all the way from Central Asia down to Gwadar and perhaps Karachi. If you talk about the energy infrastructure, if you have 100 million sitting in India, dependent on gas that comes from Central Asia, passes through Pakistan, the ability of that country to undermine Pakistan every day will become far less. If we can create a model, and this is the real test, I think, if we can create a model whereby the Chinese, Pakistan, the US, Afghanistan, and any other country can co-invest in connectivity projects that benefit Afghanistan, that benefit Central Asia, that benefit Pakistan, you have positive stakes where we can play a role to bring the temperature of the great power competition down in and around our region. Otherwise, I've heard a lot of people talk to me and say, why don't we just avoid being part of this? So let me just say that in the national security policy, we coined this conversation, or didn't coin, but we essentially highlighted this conversation about no camp politics. And we said it again and again. But no camp politics is a function of what happens in the great power competition. If we don't want to go in one camp versus the other, we have to find ways to make ourselves positively relevant. We cannot hope that somehow we will just play ostrich, hide, and the greater powers of the world will not care about where Pakistan stands. We are too important a country, our location is too important, and frankly, the history of our foreign policy is to be relevant to most of the world, sometimes to our own detriment. I want to give you a conceptual framework. Just think through this. There are 3 nodes of great power competition in the world today. The first one is the Asia-Pacific theater, or the Indo-Pacific, or whatever you want to call it. That's where US and China now have been wrangling for a while. The western border of that alliance framework is India. Right? It goes all the way from US, Japan, etc., and stops at India. The second theater is what I call the fires of the Middle East. In the past 15 years, you've seen every single great power play a role in the Middle East. Whether it's positive or negative, we can debate, but there's no country that's not been in the Middle East to play that game. The eastern border of that theater is Iran, right? Because one of the main competitions is Iran versus the Gulf. And the third is what I call US-Russia. And there are 2 theaters within that. One is Eastern Europe, which we are seeing now, of course, play out. And the other one traditionally has been Russia's backyard of Central Asia down to Afghanistan. In the past 20 years, we saw Afghanistan and the great game play out there. Between Afghanistan, Iran, and India is only one country, and that's Pakistan. We are the only country in the world that is geographically situated right in the middle of these 3 theaters of great power competition. So if anybody thinks that we can just hide from this, we are sadly mistaken. So the reason to go to geoeconomics and this entire conversation of shifting Pakistan in that direction is because we have a choice to make. Either we can positively make countries interdependent on us, or we will end up playing the old game of becoming a proxy and bearing the cost of that. So that's as far as the geoeconomic space goes. The development partnership space is very simply built around 3 elements. And these 3 elements all add up as the only avenues for Pakistan to earn non-debt raising foreign exchange. There is no 4th avenue that we have at this point. export, foreign direct investment, and remittances. We as a country earn about 60 to 65 billion a year in terms of non-debt raising revenue from foreign exchange, from these three. If we get to about 95 to 100 billion, back of the envelope, others can do better calculations, but essentially 30 billion is the gap. If we get 30 billion more from these three, that is the only time you can start thinking of greater independence in your foreign policy and more tools available to position yourself in the world. If you remain indebted by 30 billion a year, talking about how we are going to maneuver ourselves is a moot point, I think. We talk about IMF as if it's the villain, but I'm not sure why we don't talk about where this 30 billion is going to come from. We talk about the world pressuring us to do this or that, but we don't talk about our own productivity and the changes we have to make to get this 30 billion gap filled. Right? I am not sure what pride there is in whoever the Pakistani leader is, both civil and military, having to go around the world and asking for this 30 billion gap to be filled every year. The way to do this is essentially to work on export growth, FDI, and a dedicated manpower export strategy that brings back more remittances. So on that count, I don't need to say much, but let me just ask very humbly to myself and others in the audience who think through these things. Do we have an investment climate where people should come and invest? If not, what needs to change? Are we part of regional trade and investment groupings that would allow us to benefit from that space? Compared to, let's say, other countries who've done much better. New financial arrangements coming up in the world. The dollar-euro domination going down. Are we ready to actually create space and utilize that and benefit from that? There's another conversation, a colleague of mine is sitting here who's always talked about the sanctity of legal contract in this country. Do we have domestic laws that would protect investors to come and invest, or will we end up losing $6 billion every 3 years even with the investment that does come in? So ladies and gentlemen, the point is, geoeconomics, as far as I am concerned, and frankly as far as the state is concerned, because this was a document that was produced by the state of Pakistan, not me, is the way forward as a subset of economic security. It's not the entire thing, it's one part of it. But if we are not going to move in the direction of securing ourselves economically, the rest of the conversation is entirely irrelevant. And for those of you who think of geostrategy much more than geoeconomics, by the way, I am one of them as well, let me say that the only way to secure our strategic interests in the next 20 years is through economic security. I would even make the case to you that Pakistan's hand on Kashmir will be strongest if you come at it after having some semblance of economic security, rather than only looking at it from a security and strategic prism. Because the world is unlikely to be fair to us, just to us, and support what is a very legitimate cause on our part, and we've seen the world's lackluster reaction to that. Finally, I want to say two things to internalize, for all of us to internalize. One, the world is now gradually going to move more and more towards economic nationalism. You are going to see more restrictions, more sanctions, more coercive measures in the economic and financial space. And the only countries that will benefit and succeed are ones who are competitive in this environment. The days of handouts, ladies and gentlemen, are over. And we must accept this reality. And it's a good thing, not a bad thing. We simply need to focus on the things that will now give us space to become competitive. This is not a fair world. This is not a just world. I saw FATF every single day. It was a political maneuver at the end of the day with technology immersed in it. We will have this again and again. We are not a country that is positioned where we will get passes from much of the world. We have enmity with countries who end up being stronger and playing a far more petty game, unfortunately. And within that, we have to find the space to build on this geoeconomic connectivity model and move from assistance to development partnerships. And my last point is, if we have to make this change internally, there are 3 conversations that we as a country need to start having immediately. The first is, how do we ensure policy continuity of national priorities? You will not be able to change in terms of where we want to go if every 2 years there is uncertainty, or every 5 years, or every 7 years, or 3 years, uncertainty about what kind of policy we are going to adopt on a particular national priority. I was just reading this morning as I was coming in the newspapers, that the federal cabinet has approved an overhaul of the power sector. I think this is the 10th overhaul in the last 20 years. And you mark my words, we will come up with the exact same answer every time. So one is policy continuity. So the political leaderships of Pakistan, leaderships plural, civil military, have to come together and decide how to do this. Second, we need to have a conversation between our public sector and our private sector. Because ultimately, private sector is going to be the engine of growth. And it's a very broken relationship. The private sector feels that the public sector, all they do is stop growth, they don't know what they're doing, they're all generalists. The public sector feels they're all rich people who usurp resources, don't pay taxes, we don't want to entertain them. There is no constructive conversation I know of on how the private sector model is going to take over beyond rent seeking and develop the economy that we've talked about. And the third and most important from the perspective of what I am saying, and I implore you to think about this, is there any structured forum, dialogue, or process where those who think about security intellectually talk to those who think about the economy intellectually? Is there any conversation where both sides can convince each other that the intersection of what both want lies somewhere in the geoeconomic domain? By saying geoeconomics, we are not giving up on our key security interests. And by talking about Kashmir and other areas, we are not saying that we can't move towards the economy. But there is no conversation to speak of in that framework. How do we bring our best economists, best security experts together to advise the governments of the time on how you bring convergence to these two topics, which I said are 2 sides of the same coin, but unfortunately in our conversation it's always a contestation between security and the economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Moeed Yusuf, for the lucid way you have contextualized geoeconomics in our national context, including the challenges we confront. Dr. Moeed Yusuf, we are going to field questions pertaining to your remarks at this juncture. Let's take 3 questions and then proceed with the remainder of that. I hope the microphones are ready. I do see hands up. All right. Air Chief Marshal Abbas Khattak Sahab. Yeah, please.
Thank you, Mr. Yusuf. I start off by my ignorance about economics. Having spent 38 years in the Air Force, we didn't get much time to study economics. In your lecture, geoeconomics, you 2 or 3 times mentioned the location of Pakistan. And if I recall correctly, ever since the inception of our country, we have continued to harp on the importance of our geostrategic location. But I put it to you that this very strategic location of Pakistan has ended Pakistan in more troubles than benefits. For the simple reason, and you talk of connectivity, that we have on our western border a country perennially in war, the ill effects of which have continuously spilled over to Pakistan. On the other side, we have India, reluctant to acknowledge our existence. And in terms of connectivity, the only optimistic aspect that you narrated was through China and Gwadar. Now, do you ever see a peaceful Afghanistan in the near future for the Central Asian argument that you give, which is phenomenal if Afghanistan is peaceful and all that, and if we can connect with it and get a great benefit out of trade and all that. But the connectivity with China via Gwadar also seems to be under threat. There are antagonistic elements and all that to ensure that this does not come through. So where would you put Pakistan's optimistic outlook that you put in terms of economics under these conflicting and contradictory situations in, say, the next 5 years or so? Thank you.
I took your body language, understood. We'll take 2 more questions, then Dr. Meed Yusuf can answer them. I'm holding my breath and calling on Raza Saab. I'm holding my breath very deeply. Please, sir.
Raza Khan, Special Correspondent, PTU World. Sir Meed, good to hear you. Your Islamabad Security Dialogue, I asked you a question and I'm still looking for an answer now that you're no more the National Security Advisor of Pakistan. I asked you then and I ask you now, although you are a great expert in your field, there's a word utopia which comes into mind after listening to you again. There's an ex-ambassador of Pakistan who was present in the room when TAPI was about to be signed, and he says, even then he said, till the time there is peace in Afghanistan, which is not on the horizon, and he's talking about mid-90s. How are you talking about Iran, Central Asia, India, everybody, and Pakistan, becoming a corridor or a link between all these different powers? Whereas India and its National Security Advisor and their Modi government is hell-bent on making plans for the destruction of Pakistan. The rise of TTP, BLA, BLF, their activities, unless we destroy and crush these pro-India elements, and for that we need geopolitics, not geoeconomics. How are we going to go towards the road of geoeconomics that you
I take
proclaim?
your point. Thank you, Raza Saab. I want to take one from this side. I see a very enthusiastic hand here.
Assalamualaikum sir, I am Mohammad Zaid Babar from Kazaz University, student of Defense and Strategic Study. Sir, regional and global players' ambitions obviously will destabilize the region in near future. How Pakistan can grow without regional peace and security economically? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for the brevity of that. Given the shortage of time, Dr. Meed Saab, please. Yield to you.
Thank you. I think the first 2 questions, Khatter Saab, Aapka and Raza, I can combine. The genius of policy is to find solutions in a constrained environment. We all know the problems. And you're absolutely right. In 70 years, the location has brought us more negativity than not. Why? Because the approach was, if there is a war next door and we can get monetary assistance out of that, it will benefit Pakistan. And what we are arguing here is that can we find an economic interdependence model that can make it far more costly for countries to undermine Pakistan. Right? Geostrategy doesn't go anywhere. Geopolitics remains intact, but the approach is slightly different. Now let's talk about Afghanistan. I don't think anybody is hoping for a completely transformed, peaceful Afghanistan. Since the Taliban have come in, and this is not a comment on their coming in or not, there is a physical corridor, road corridor that is operational between Central Asia and Pakistan. Right? When I was in government, we agreed on allowing Afghan trucks to go all the way down to the port and Pakistani trucks crossing over. There is the TIR arrangement, etc. Where Central Asia, suboptimal, of course you want rail, you want better road connectivity, is actually now trading through Pakistan. We didn't have those agreements in place. Some countries now we do, other countries we still don't, but the work was in progress and I'm sure it still is. That's how you create that space. If the mindset would be, we are not going to allow this because there could be 2 terrorist attacks coming from across the border, that's a purely geopolitical mindset which will hold back any possibility of connectivity. That's sort of the change that we are looking at. It's incremental, it's small, it's not going to be perfect overnight. So I think in that stead, if you start looking at Iran isolated, we started a TIR arrangement to Turkey. If Iran opens up, let's say tomorrow, got a much bigger space to operate, right? So that's how I think you build that space. China, whoever thought that when Gwadar starts taking off or CPEC takes off, there won't be attempts to sabotage it? That's a given. That's the geopolitical environment and the great power competition that we have to live with. And we've got to secure ourselves and make sure that CPEC continues on whatever vision we have. This is not easy. There is I'm not, somebody said I'm optimistic. I'm not optimistic. I'm giving you a very realistic picture. The bottom line is, after 7 years of deliberation, multiple governments, the state of Pakistan came up with a product that said, if we don't get economic security right, despite all these constraints, we are not going to get anywhere. And that's the environment that we have to operate in. Just the one other angle, I think aapka third question bhi yahi tha essentially, which I've answered. On India, as you've mentioned, keep in mind these policies are not meant for 6 months or 3 month time horizons. Modi wasn't there 10 years ago. Maybe there's a different mindset, maybe there isn't, maybe we move forward, maybe we don't. But you don't create documents expressing visions and implementation plans attached to that, just talking about the moment you're in. I want to give you a provocative proposition. Based on what you've said, if I'm an Indian hawk, and if I really want to see Pakistan undermined, what I need to do is continue to strengthen the view that you just gave. Because that view will strengthen the hands of people in Pakistan who will say, we don't need to change anything, we have to keep doing what we've been doing because India wants to destruct us, India is doing this, India is doing that, and we continue to stew in our own soup. They continue to grow, we continue to fall back, jingoism remains the name of the game. It hasn't worked. I am not for a second suggesting, and you have my track record in front of you on Kashmir. I think I talked about that internationally more than, but my job as National Security Advisor is to see what is the best possible way for Pakistan to improve the lives of Kashmiris and get to my goal in Kashmir, which is a UN ordained plebiscite to get to an answer, right? My job is not to make you or somebody happy or to become popular. And if I think that the way to get there is first to get X or Y in order internally, and that will maximize my chances, that is what I will tell you. Yes, it goes in against the jingoism and the spirit of standing up and saying, I'm stronger than you are, but I actually think that the role all of us have to play is to pragmatically think what will get us closest to that goal. And I think the decision you find in this document was, you have to go the economic security route even to achieve your geostrategic objectives without giving an inch or even a comma or a full stop up as far as your national security goals are concerned. और ले लें? दो तीन और अगर और आप बताएं whatever. नहीं
I would like to express my gratitude to Dr. Muid Yusuf for sparing this time and conveying his vision. It is something for us to think about very carefully, and now his discussion will be supplemented with international perspectives. I'm very grateful to 3 speakers, 1 in person and 2 online, who I will present. But first I would like to request a round of applause for Dr. Muid Yusuf. Now, what if I told you that there is a person who has been a sinologist for as far back as she can remember? This person speaks Chinese and Russian and Latvian and English and 2 other languages, has been an interpreter for her government, and for important officials of her country in China, heads a China Studies Center, and is, by my testimony, I stand by this, one of the most lucid thinkers on contemporary China and Russia in the modern era, particularly from an IR perspective, even more particularly from the narrative control, narrative analysis as the prism. Well, I have that person here today. Dr. Una Alexandra Berzhina Cherenkova has joined us. I'll invite you to speak on the stage and share your thoughts.
Excellencies, Dr. Gohan, we're very honored to be here today, and I want to take this opportunity to thank CAS, and it's indeed has been very enlightening the discussions today during the GSTAR. So, first of all, as a narrative analyst, when you're tasked with talking about geoeconomics and knowing very little on the subject, you examine whether it is a good lens to approach a topic. So today, please let me touch upon some of the aspects of the geoeconomic impact of great power rivalry in the Asia-Pacific along 3 lines. So first of all, I want to look if it's a good lens, and I want to argue that it is. I've been convinced. Second of all, I want to reflect on what has the great power rivalry in the Asia-Pacific taught us. I will try to keep it in the geoeconomic sphere, but as a novice, you will have to forgive me if I move a little bit into the politics. And the third thing I want to do is to try to kind of take a stab at the question of what will the geoeconomic impact of great power rivalry in the Asia-Pacific be, and what will it mean for small and middle powers. So, and I also have a disclaimer. I have a bit of a tendency to stroll back into talking about my region. So I come from the Baltic States. I come from Northeastern Europe. So pardon me if I start out a sentence by mentioning Asia Pacific and then I end up with an example from the EU. It's an issue that I am aware of. So is it a good lens? And let's call this the adoption of the orphaned subject. I would like to continue on Dr. Usman's excellent presentation on the topic. And of course, we are seeing what we are seeing today, and that's been also the motive of today's talks, is that we're seeing increasing security architecture on all sides. We've talked about AUKUS today. We've mentioned the Quad. Of course, there's also the upcoming NATO enlargement as per the request of Finland and Sweden. And there's also the NATO political Indo-Pacific outlook. We've seen the strategic concept come out, much debated, but it's there. So we kind of keep coming up with clever names like stable uncertainty, and then we wake up that it's not stable anymore. On top of that, of course, we have what Air Marshal Farhad Hussein Khan today opened with, basically that the US-China competition is expanding, and what Professor Yan Xuetong also referred to, saying this China's ambition to be as strong as the US. And so even China, that up to now, and I'm a discourse analyst, right? So what I do for a living is I look at speeches of Chinese political elites, and I write about them, and I try to find, you know, some things that are or are not there. And there's a group of us. It's not a sickness, it's a profession. So what we've seen China do before, it was that the official communication coming out of the foreign policy elite, of course represented by Xi Jinping, but also people who take up on his concepts. We've seen these low-key targeted multilaterals and bilaterals, and for bigger dreams, when China would talk about bigger dreams, it would be kind of economy-related. Of course, Belt and Road Initiative is the classic example here, but basically we saw these economy-related stories of global unity. And now even China, even Xi Jinping comes up with GSI, the Global Security Initiative. Of course, we don't know what that is yet, but that is kind of a sign of the times. So what I want to say is that the discourse is oversaturated with security shorthand, and it is a very welcome improvement that a conference organized by the Air Force community of Pakistan, of all communities, is striving to introduce the economic dimension into this discourse. So yes, the answer to Dr. Yusuf's question that he asked before he left, is there a place where the stakeholders can meet and talk about the geopolitics and geoeconomics in one room? I believe the answer is it is this room right here. And so another quote from earlier today, Ambassador Raffel put it that trade agreements and economic policy needs to be the linchpin of US policy in the region as well. So we keep coming back to not losing sight of the economics. So I am of the opinion that geoeconomics is indeed the right lens to look at the region. And it is coming on the policy planning agenda as well. So the security shorthand is still there. At the same time, the economy still matters. And I've given talks at the Swedish foreign policy community, and I'm oftentimes speaking with the Danes, with the Dutch. Of course, a lot of my work has to do with Germany as well. And so I want to report to you, Usman, that your topic is orphaned no more. It has been adopted. Now, just a couple of examples here. Of course, up until a certain point, the EU didn't really know how to look at ASEAN. So what kind of an animal is it? Is it like us, but in Southeast Asia? What is the level of integration? And the understanding that it is primarily something economic that holds it together kind of was not there. And a very similar reaction came when the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership was signed and came into force in, this year, which includes 15 East Asian and Pacific nations, including China, of course, and accounts for 1/3 of the world's GDP, and includes very different, very various nations, nations that you don't normally see on the same page, right? So you have Australia, you have Dar es Salaam, you have the Philippines, you have China, Vietnam. And now, actually today, somebody mentioned TTIP. You almost feel like saying, what year is this? Because it's back on the agenda almost. So we have the Germany's finance minister, Christian Lindner, coming up with saying that, you know, TTIP was a good instrument, and we should see whether we can find any way to revive it in some form. So, and that's been also picked up in the European policy community. Again, apologies, you see I keep coming back to Europe. That's the bias that I have. So let me just remind you, of course, that TTIP was a trade deal between the EU and the United States, and that the aim was to promote the imagined trade deal promoting trade and economic growth. But what is the trap here, though? It's been very kind of lovey-dovey so far. And what is the trap? So we've been down this road before, and what should we avoid then? And what are these lessons? And that takes me to what has the great power rivalry in the Asia-Pacific taught us bit of my talk. And I want to say that it has taught us that economic interdependence is many things, many good things, but 3 things it is not. First of all, it is not a deterrent. We have been under the impression that economic interdependence can deter. There is some truth to that, but when ambitions or strategies trump these arguments, it is not a deterrent. Now, second thing, it is not a tool exclusive to the neoliberal democratic order. Something also we've been taught at school almost, and something we teach our PhD students, you know, that interdependency is the cornerstone of neoliberalism. Well, guess what? The economic binding strategy, which is almost the evil twin of interdependency, it is a geoeconomic strategy, and it is effectively being used by countries with strong state control, and I think something Usman touched upon in his presentation as well. For example, in my region, we feel Russia's pressure that way. We might freeze this winter for all we know, by the way. So, and you in your region, of course, have other pressures that are comparable to this. So this is not a tool that the good guys kind of use. It works both ways. Now, the third thing, and that is a cliche, and I apologize, is that it is not an instrument of political change or systemic change. Again, it's been said here before, right? Now, to the third part of my talk, what will then the geoeconomic impact of great power rivalry in the Asia-Pacific be? Well, first of all, and this is, I'm going to start with the bad news, and then I'm going to try to maybe make up for it in the end. First of all, it contributes to the rise of solidified, centralized state actors. And I do mean China, of course, but there are other examples here. So, and I know that my colleagues, my peers, including Maria Repnikova, have pointed out that that is not yet a reality, and it is a mistake to not make the distinction, you know, of the multi-layeredness of China's actors when conducting research abroad, right? So you have the state enterprises, you have private capital, you have province level, you have all sorts of things. But we have to say that it is a vision. It is a vision of a centralized China. And the mindset that is behind it is the mindset that in a contested environment, a country consolidates for one goal, and that contributes basically to the deglobalization that Yan Xuetong talked about today. I would like to see that, right? Maybe it's not exactly his point, but I will spin it in that direction. Now, that's the one thing. The rise of solidified centralized state actors with a very specific goal. The second thing is Western decoupling from China will happen, and it will affect the region. But decoupling is not an on and off switch, so it's not a total decoupling, but it is already affecting strategic industries and nearly strategic industries and double use and all that talk. So of course the example with the PRC conductor industry is a story that falls into this file. So I would say that it's geoeconomics, thank you very much, and it's in full swing. But there will be industries still that will see business as usual, so decoupling is not total. Of course, when you talk to the Europeans, what they're interested in, they're saying, okay, so garment, textile, food and beverage, farm and cosmetics, all these things where the money's been coming in, they're continuing, and they might, actually. Now, just a quick side note on something that Ambassador said earlier today during her talk, that about the US Invest-Align Compete. Well, I think it's almost fair, more fair than what the EU is doing, because it distinguishes between the domains very clearly. This is where we align, this is where we invest, this is where we compete. What the EU is doing, actually, it's pursuing a three-pronged approach vis-a-vis China specifically, which is intentionally very murky. It says that China, you know the mantra, right? It's a strategic rival, it's a systemic rival, strategic competitor, and then it's also a partner. So, and then like take it as you will kind of a story. And now, in fact, another thing that might come out of big power rivalry in this case is that there's a debate within the EU that China will become an even stronger global competitor, and essentially, how do we respond? Currently, we do not see any hints that the EU could review the three-sided approach or this three-pronged policy. And this rhetoric has trickled down to the member states and to the national policies as well, including that of Germany. But it is intentionally murky, which has also its good sides and also its bad sides. But now on the flip side, and this is where I want to kind of, that's the last big bit of what I want to talk to you today about. I think that great power rivalry, counterintuitively perhaps, provides wiggle space for small and medium powers. As a representative of a very small power, of a country that has under 2 million people, it's very hard for me to put us and Pakistan in the same category. Obviously, we're not. So we are the definition of a small power, whereas you are a nuclear power and one of the very visible middle powers. But still, we are kind of in the same basket when it comes to great power rivalry. And the previous speaker also outlined that, I think. And our challenges are comparable, I think. Energy security, something I alluded to earlier because that is going to affect me. War impact on the economic capacities of the populations, the choices surrounding cutting edge tech, that kind of thing. Insert country name here, we're all dealing with it. And even though we are positioned differently vis-a-vis centers of global power, we can still introduce solutions to transnational problems because we are not antagonizing. And we've seen it in the UN, and we see it in the EU as well when it happens. So I'm talking food security, climate change, pandemics. It depends on our expertise, obviously. Now, just a quick side note on what do I mean by position differently. And I cannot pass up on the opportunity to comment on the discussion of the previous panel. Please allow me, I'm sorry. So the question was about the war in Ukraine. And that is very much my region, so please forgive my bias. And the question was basically that, in fact, this opinion that it was NATO enlargement that pushed and caused Russia to act. Well, I would like to say that it is indeed a very widespread argument, and I understand where it's coming from, and I appreciate the discussion, but I would like to point out that this kind of argument undermines small and medium nation agency, and that is something that we are after. So it's not exactly about NATO expansion because there's very different underlying factors here, but I want to say that it is about geoeconomics, essentially. Ukraine's choice is very geoeconomical. Ukraine wants stability. It wants the role in a little bit, kind of again to the point that we're all similar, it wants the role that Dr. Yusuf outlined for Pakistan as well. But what Ukraine knows very well, and we've been talking to Ukrainian policymakers as well, is that this proposed neutrality de facto locks it into the Russian influence sphere. And that is not conducive to transparency, to stability, to FDI, to balanced growth, or to prosperity at the end of the day. So this is an example of difference in outlooks, and this is an example of how you can introduce geoeconomics into the equation for a better understanding of things on the ground. And my last bit is that I think that through minilateralism, through ad hoc cooperation, through positive interdependency, something that Dr. Yusuf used, and I sign under this is a very good way to put it, and subnational strategic decentralization, importantly, right? That is how small and middle powers and their subnational actors, our champions, have agency and opportunity in this quote-unquote stable uncertainty. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Dr. Una. In particular, I want to emphasize the results of your narrative analysis regarding the centralized solidified states role and how smaller entities can exercise agency in this. I won't forget that you've coined the term geotechnomics. I think there's a good paper there for us to write in the future. I now proceed to our online speakers. I begin with Professor Carl Moore. Professor Carl Moore is joining us from Montreal, Canada. Professor Carl Moore is a man of enormous intellectual stature. I say that because he was, and in many ways still is, a teacher of mine. He is a friend of Cass. He has come to many of our events virtually, and I would have loved to show him around Islamabad. On a future occasion, we shall do that. And as Dr. Una proceeded with the impact of geopolitical rivalry in Asia Pacific on geoeconomics, I would now like the holistic perspective, which is typified in Professor Carl Moore's thinking and his work, for his exposition. So I yield to you, Professor Moore. Very, very happy to have you with us.
Speak at CAST to such an impressive audience with such outstanding fellow speakers. It was Dr. Choi has National Order of Hyperpolygots. Would have loved to be there in Pakistan. I've never had the chance, but I was teaching in Iceland last week, and for family reasons, had to be here in Montreal, hopefully next year. And very much appreciate Dr. Yusuf. Great chance for me as a teacher to learn from other people. I'd like to talk about four things briefly today. I think they're germane to an evolving global order, the overarching theme for today. First, to look at globalization in the ancient medieval worlds. Yusuf, could you put Yusuf, is the slide there?
I
assume it is. So
we don't have the slides, but we can proceed. You could share them from your side, but I've seen them, and so you can speak without them, perhaps. Or slides.
I'll just push forward then without them. All right, I'll do that. So first, global in the ancient medieval worlds. It's something which I've written more books with a co-author, David Lewis, his historian. And we argued in these books and a dozen academic journals that the first multinationals were in Assyria, the first and there was no one world globalization in the Roman Empire. Now, we very carefully called it no one world globalization because we wanted to differentiate from today's globalization, or at least the version of globalization that existed in the year 2000 when the book came out. We did not find, or more accurately, archaeologists, because we didn't do the work ourselves, did not find Google in the sands of the Middle East. What their evidence suggested to us was the rise of multinationals that had hundreds of employees in more than one country, that is a multinational enterprise, different from our largest today, but nevertheless small multinationals. We talk much today with globalization. What we found in ancient Romeization, it did not include Canada, the US, Japan, and Korea, which you could hardly discuss globalization today and not bring them into the future. What today we call the UK, to the north of Germany, throughout Europe, into Africa, and trade existed in considerable amounts between Rome, India, Saudi Arabia, and China, or at least the names we used to call those countries today. It was entertaining for us when we realized that Pliny the Elder complained about the trade deficit that Rome had with Saudi Arabia, India, and China back in his day. And at the same time as we were writing, President Bush in the US was complaining about America's trade deficit with the same three countries, albeit for different reasons. Today, oil from Saudi Arabia, IT services from India, and almost anything manufactured from China. The same three countries back then, it was spices from India, China, pottery from China, etc. So something where it was interesting to see that there was echoes of today's world in the past, and that might shed light on our thinking today. Our second book was an airport version of the first book called Foundations of Corporate Empire. I recall sitting with my publisher in a pub in London, which is a British thing to do, and he asked if I could write a final chapter which covered why we might care in the modern world today for those ancient empires. In the West, we tend to avoid history, particularly North America, which we call the New World, partly rejecting the old world of history back in Europe. I entitled that chapter, Should the World Become American? As you might recall, for those who are over 40, it was a decade or so after the fall of the Berlin Wall. We had former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney visit one of our CEO Insights MBA class last week. And we visited with Mr. Mulroney because he played a considerable part connecting President Reagan, a friend of his, with Mr. Gorbachev, who died just recently. At the time we're writing the book, President Clinton was traveling the world telling Americans that they should wholesalely adopt the American-style capitalism. We thought that actually, when we looked at the ancient world, there was more than one way to run an economy. That we had Assyria, which is what we call temple-style capitalism. We had ancient Greece, which was more entrepreneurial. We had the Phoenicians, again, similar to Assyria temple capitalism, where the eye bankers of the day were the priests in the temple. And Rome we called legionary, military-led capitalism. You might remember the famous saying, all roads lead to Rome, actually is the exact opposite. For military reasons, the roads were built so the military could get around the empire and make sure things kept in line with Rome. So we said that actually there's more than one way to run and change and improve their economy, but they should stay Japanese. And there's three things you had to think about when you think about the right form of economy: culture, history, social institutions. So that's what we argued in that book. Our next book, which is almost done, but I'm sure it'll take longer than we anticipate, and anybody who's an author knows what I'm talking about, is entitled China and the Nations. In our three previous books, there was only one nation that was always important. Not the US, not Germany or the UK, but China was clearly the winner. That China throughout the ancient and medieval and even modern times was the only country that always played a central role. Now, India and to some degree Pakistan were part of that as well. But China was the winner. And it might say to the US, perhaps arrogantly, but I think it would be within reason, saying, you guys have been important for 50 or 60 years, come back to us when you have 500 years. They wouldn't say that, but it's something that some Chinese might think, and not inappropriately. Why does this matter that China is so important? Because history matters. And this is something here in the New World, Canada and the US, we tend to not worry about history. But when you think about China, history does matter very much. And there's some interesting research looking at Chinese history texts. And we see that, if we could go to the next slide, please, that would be appreciated. We see that in history in China really does matter. That we see that young Chinese students in high school or college or university are taught a very Chinese view of the world. And if you want to understand China, where it's going to go, how they're going to operate, it is very helpful to know how they teach history. Because what they're doing, and there's some quotes here from some of the research that have been done, I'll let you read it for a moment while I natter on, is that China has a specific view of the world, and to understand how to interact with them, how to deal with them, you have to understand their view of history. Thanks. You can take the slide down now if you don't mind. I'm done with the slides. So this is an important thing for us to understand outside of China, is how they view the world. And I think you're very blessed in Pakistan to have a better view of China than we are here in the West. So I'm done with the slides now. If you could take it down, please. I'd appreciate it. A second big point I'd like to bring beyond the importance of history. Later in the 2000s, Alan Rugman, at the time one of the top international business academics in the world, the late Alan Rugman, and I wrote some articles building on Alan's argument that the world is more regional than global. I'm delighted to say I recruited Alan from the University of Toronto to Oxford, where I was on the faculty there. He had a landmark book called The End of Globalization back in 2001. He argued that the world is much more regional markets than global, and that was an unusual view at the time. He and I wrote some other articles about how regionalization actually trumped globalization. Now, it's interesting because with Brian Mulroney here last week, we revisited NAFTA. And when we think of NAFTA, that really made the US, Canada, and Mexico more integrated. We had in Latin America. Today, globalization pressed ahead for a number of years, but then COVID changed globalization to make it more of a regional approach. And this is important for Canada and for Pakistan, that we recognize that regions really do matter. And they matter more than they did before COVID. That we are worried in North America about supply chains. We don't want to depend on China as much as we have in the past. We've also worried about transportation of freighters, of ships going around the world. Are those value chains safe? Are they dependable? And it means that regions become more of a thing where Canada and Mexico, that things will be delivered. Because we're such an important trading partner, by far Canada's largest trade partner. Plus, we share a border where Canada and the US control that border. We're not worried about pirates and ships. We're not worried about Russia as a power cutting off some trade, or perhaps, as you remember, the Suez Canal was closed down because of a ship and a mishap there last year. So that fragility of globalization means we're now more focused on regionalization. And something Ellen and I wrote about back in early 2000s, but that idea of regionalization today. So I'd like to, this week, is entitled, "Okay Boomer, Working Better with Millennials and Generation Z." And the "okay boomer" was kind of a phrase going around the world a year or two ago, and I'm a boomer, so my publishers seem to enjoy making fun of me. But it's a great title. When I teach it to my undergrads, they laugh and they enjoy the title of it. What Generation Z are different, and the younger millennials. For the book, my students and I interview over 500 C-suite executives, mainly those. I've been blessed, and starting with my PhD, I've interviewed about 1,000 CEOs. There's few advantages of age. One is you've done something longer than almost anyone else around. And so interviewing 1,000 CEOs is very unusual. And we talked to every one of them about Generation Z. And if you are a CEO, you're thinking about your younger workforce and the impact they're having on how you do things. Let me put the argument of the book in one sentence. People over 40 years old with their degree were taught a modern worldview. People under 30 with a university degree have been taught a postmodern worldview. Postmodern is the worldview of young people, and it's the worldview we teach at universities. And what postmodernism is a rejection of the modern worldview that failed and fell short. The ideas that I was taught as a young man have fallen short. The importance of science as the new Messiah. The idea that God is dead and religion is irrelevant, and it's something where what we see around the world, that faith is something which is increasingly relevant in a way we moderns thought would go away. And it's an important thing in many of our societies. Now, three things stand out is about how do you lead Generation Z. And it's not so much lead as work with. One is, it's not the death of hierarchy, but the decline of hierarchy, at least in the West. And I think Pakistan is different in this way, but the ideas that come from the West are going to have more and more impact on Pakistan over time. These subtly and not so subtly come around the world, coming from Western Europe and North America particularly. Part of the decline is based on big topics such as the nature of truth and who has truth. These in much of the world with a capital T. I still believe there's truth with a capital T, but there's less of it. And not only the nature of truth, but who has it. And what young people are taught and believe is that their ideas are as good as my ideas. Now that's getting carried away. They're overstating it. But nevertheless, that's what we teach them, and that's what they believe to a considerable degree. So truth is shifted from older people like myself to themselves. The net result, we need to listen to them more and take on board their ideas. So, excuse me. One of the ideas in the West is to be reverse mentored. So I point out to my students that 75% of the time I'm mentoring you, but 25% of the time they're mentoring me. That may be overstating it, but there's some truth to it, ironically, that young people teach older people because they know about technology. They know about social media, things like that. I think all of us would agree that my undergraduates know more about social media than I do. They need to teach us and mentor us. Now, what I do point to my undergrads, and when I say what's the flip side of the 25% of time being reverse mentored, I've never had an undergrad put up their hand and tell them I'm mentoring them. So the older people like myself and many of the people in the audience, we have a central role to play as mentors of young people. This are teaching us is a newish thought and one that I think we need to take on board. Now, I believe that Pakistan, thankfully, has not gone far down this path as North America and Europe. Nevertheless, this worldview is one that's spreading from the US and the UK and so on. And I must apologize that to some degree, professors like myself are messing up our youth. Yes, they are the future. Thanks to the very considerable of joining you, and I very much look forward to being in Pakistan hopefully next year, and enjoyed listening to the speakers before me. Very, very interesting. I'll now pass the control, if you would, back to my former student and truly one of the more impressive at Hill, Oxford, and Cambridge. Our host today was probably the most impressive.
Thank you very much, Professor Moore. I think that the comments you have made are of extreme import because we have to take the geoeconomic transitions in the world in a historical context that takes culture, society, and history into context. You have a long repertoire of publications from the globalization era, and at that time you argued for regionalism, which has come true. And in the same spirit, we have to anticipate what things will be true 20 years from now, which requires us to understand the value systems of the new generation coming up. It may not be Xi Jinping ruling China 30 years from now. He's in his late 60s. Same with Biden. He's 80. He won't be the guy sitting in the United States. So what are the values of the new leaders coming in? And I think this is one of the deep insights about us anticipating geoeconomics in a world condition, in the world's context, going forward. I very much appreciate that, Professor Moore, and thank you for your kind remarks about me. I want to now introduce our speaker, Professor Dr. Wang Wen from the Chongyang Institute of Financial Studies. Professor Wang Wen is a scholar, outspoken thinker, and a man who truly understands the new generation of Chinese. In fact, I would argue that he is among the thought leaders of China who will help to shape the contours of the new superpower. He is a man who is, he's a man who is reaching out to us from Moscow right now, and he understands not just China in its local context, but also China in relation to other countries. That is why I'm seeking his guidance for our panel on peaceful cooperation. As in my presentation, I said that we all really have to work together on this stuff that the world is confronting. And he has been an advocate of this partnership, respect, and working together in the geoeconomic context. So I yield to you, Professor, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for having me. Actually, right now, the former three speakers all talk about a question, how China see the world. In fact, I think it's a very simple question, because this week, China is holding the 20th National Congress of the Communist Party of China, which is the most important congress every 5 years. Last Sunday, President Xi Jinping's report to the 20th Party Congress and described China's views on the world. It is highly recommended for everyone and can be found on Google and Baidu. Very easy to find the report. But however, today we are discussing the geoeconomic, and I cannot say too much about the 20th Party Congress. I just firstly want to ask a question. In the past 40 years, especially since the end of the Cold War, is there a single place that can describe the development of East Asia? I call it peaceful regional connectivities and prosperity. This is the topic of my speech today. In East Asia, including Southeast Asia, China, Japan, and South Korea, with a population of more than 2 billion, regional peace has been maintained for the past 40 years, and there has been no foreign war or military conflict with each other. Despite some diplomatic frictions, East Asia countries have resolved them properly with diplomatic wisdom. In one region, 40 years of peace for 2 billion people is very rare in world history. In East Asia, in the past 40 years, the cross-border interconnections of transportation, trade, and investment has surpassed all the other countries. In terms of the transportation, in December 2021, last year, the China-Laos Railway was opened, and the Trans-Asia Railway made important progress. I believe that by 2035, it is possible to travel from Beijing to Singapore or from Beijing to Taipei by train. In terms of trade, the total international trade of East Asia countries accounts for 40% of the world total. With the advancement of the 10+3 RCEP and the China-Japan-Korea Free Trade Area negotiations, the trade strength of East Asia countries will continue to increase. The growth of the foreign investment in East Asia countries is also the fastest in the world. So I think peace and connectivity have made East Asia the most prosperous region in the world over the past 40 years. Regional economic growth, including average annual growth of the digital economy, is the fastest in the world. Infrastructure construction investment ahead of other regions. Public security in East Asia city is world class. Whether you go to Shanghai, Beijing, Seoul, Tokyo, Colombo, Singapore, Bangkok, or Honey, you can feel safe, convenient, and modern. A friend of mine, he is from South Asia. His name is Plug Kanda. He wrote a book 3 years ago named For Future is Asia. And I agree with most of the points in his book. East Asia, at least in the past 40 years, has indeed been in the period of rare prosperity in history. The future does belong to East Asia. Why? I think there are three reasons for this. First, a stable and continuous domestic policy centered on the economic growth. Most countries in East Asia focus on the economic construction, maintain a social stability, and increase investment in infrastructure. At the same time, they adopt open door policies to attract capitals, tourists, business, and technology from all over the world. That's the first reason. Second reason of East Asia prosperity is that to maintain vigilance against the U.S. military involvement and relatively independent security policy. There are inevitably many historical contradictions between countries. In East Asia country, the resolution of frictions and conflicts tends to be negotiated within the region, rather than relying entirely on the country outside the region. The law of regional security in the past half century is that as long as the United States is too involved, there will be wars in the region, such as Middle East, North Africa, South Europe, East Europe, and so on. The third reason for East Asia prosperity is that the social policy committed to poverty reduction, public security, and the equalization of basic social service. In the past 30 years, East Asia countries have amounted for 80% of the global poverty reduction. East Asia countries use intelligence technology to innovate urban governance, crack down on crimes such as drugs, smuggling, theft, murder, and maintain the social stability and unity. The chronic element of so-called divided societies in many countries is relatively mild in East Asia. So in other words, in the past, the world paid attention too much to the experience of the United States. Pay attention too much to the experience of the United States. Now it seems that it is necessary to pay attention to, summarize, and sort out of the experience of East Asia, including experience of China. So East Asia economic policy, security policies, and social policy have certain commonality, which are worthy of discovery by the world. So now the prosperity of stability of East Asia is affecting and driving the surrounding areas, such as South Asia, Central Asia, and Russia Far East. Maintaining a more cooperation with East Asia is a new driving force for the sustainable development of South Asia, Central Asia, or the Russia Far East. But I have to say, for now, there are always forces trying to undermine East Asia's prosperity and stability. To contain the prosperity of East Asia, it is to maintain the old Western hegemony and the conservative international order. So now this force has suppressed the rise of Russia by provoking war in Ukraine while suppressing European prosperity. If a war in East Asia is provoked, the world will return to the time of the World War II, and the countries outside the region will be the ultimate winners. Who? Yes, I'm referring to the United States. Of course, I have to say, maintaining peaceful regional connectivities and prosperities is not very easy. From the perspective of next 10 years, there are about four most dangerous areas inside East Asia. First, as we all know, is a Taiwan Strait issue. As we know, the United States keeps sending high officials to Taiwan and sell weapons to Taiwan, which is actually provoking the Chinese mainland to liberate Taiwan by force. The Chinese mainland has its strengths, but the Chinese mainland remains patient and resolves it peacefully as much as possible. Therefore, at present, the most important thing is still to contain Taiwan's independence and prevent the United States from interfering in Taiwan Strait affairs. That's the first. Second thing is that the North Korea nuclear issues. The key to solving the North Korea nuclear issue is still to eliminate the US military threat and uncontrolled intervention. The more the United States threats North Korea militarily, the more likely North Korea will take aggressive action. The third issue is the South China Sea issue. China and ASEAN has been negotiating a code of conduct in the South China Sea for more than 20 years. Facts have proved that China and ASEAN countries are capable of maintaining peace and stability in the South China Sea region by eliminating external interference, and are capable of reaching regional rules that are jointly abided by through a consultation. Fourth, the China-India border issue. There are always some people who encourage the border conflict between China and India to intensify. But it must be seen that if China and India, the two Asian civilizations conflict, who will win in the end? I think the country outside the region. So in addition to these four issues, there are other conflicts, such as conflicts between China and Japan on the history and island issues, the conflicts between Japan and South Korea on the territory, and so on. These problems should be left to the East Asia country and people to solve themselves. After 40 years of hard work, we should be optimistic that East Asia, which has huge differences in religion, ethnicity, territory, ideology, etc., has fewer and fewer conflicts and tends to be resolved. But from outside, there are still many interference factors. For example, the US offshore balancing strategy for East Asia. And the great inflection in 2022 may lead to an economic crisis in Europe and the United States, etc. They will all have an impact on the prosperity of East Asia. So this is what I have to be said finally about the roles of China. For more than 30 years, American politicians, think tanks, and media have all been talking about the China threat. But China did not start a war, did not have a financial crisis, did not send outside the refugees, did not have a military conflict with its neighbors, and did not export economic crisis. At the same time, the United States launched or provoked a war in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Ukraine in the past 20 years. The international financial crisis broke out in 2008. Who is the biggest threat to the world? So finally, I have to say, in the just released U.S. National Security Strategy report, the U.S. once again regard China as its biggest strategic competitor. China is reluctant to have a new Cold War with the United States and does not regard the United States as a strategic competitor. Instead, it hopes to coexist peacefully, respect each other, and jointly contribute to world development. In China's views, even if there is competition with the United States in the future, it should also be a competition for who is more responsible and who contributes more to the world. So the practice of the past 40 years has proved that China is a stable anchor of East Asia security and prosperity. As long as China continues to develop and maintain security and stability, it is impossible for East Asia to become chaotic. In the future, China will also maintain this role as a stable anchor. So therefore, my conclusion is that the theme of the topic of our today international conference is involving world order. I think this is a very important topic. So my conclusion is to redefine the discourse, the order of the thought, the thinking, and especially the perception of East Asia. So re-observe East Asia, re-understand China, and re-understand the future. That's my what I want to say. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wang Wen. very important insights from your speech, including the commonality of the success stories, the seeking of harmony amongst regional players, the need for peaceful coexistence, and some good practices like the continuity of policies and keeping economics as a priority. These are best practices that transcend geography, and these are things that we have to take to heart, regardless of the hotspots as identified, the Taiwan Strait, North Korea, etc. It's the world that is in trouble as a whole. And that's why I was very happy to have for today's panel a North American perspective, a European perspective, South Asian perspective, East Asian perspective to do this. Given the interest of time, I will ask for our Q&A, which begins now, 3 questions. And you can identify yourself, point out who it's targeted to if it is, and then we can wrap up the session. I see one hand over here, sir.
Hello, Assalamu alaikum. My name is Shafkat. I am a MPhil scholar of International Relations from Islamic University. My question is the great power rivalry in Asia Pacific. There are 2 alliances. One is alliance led by make a Quad, and another alliance countered by China with the help of Russia. So my question is that, okay, what is the future of Quad? Because United States make it it's the military alliance like Asia.
What is the future of Quad? I take your point. Who is this directed to?
Mr. Ma'am.
Professor Wang Wen? Okay, thank you. I saw another hand just next to you, ma'am. Did you have your hand up? Sir, you?
My question is to Dr. Una, and this is beyond Asia Pacific. Europeans were instigated, manipulated, used, misused in World War I, World War II, Cold War, NATO, and you failed to analyze the situation at that time. United States ending up becoming a superpower and continues to do so. Why once again you appear to be failing in analyzing the situation in case of Ukraine, where Europe is getting at the verge of devastation and huge energy crisis. And I have heard that even load shedding has started in some of the European countries. And United States is sitting in an isolated, cozy Western hemisphere. Thank you.
Okay. One more, otherwise, Michelle?
My question is for Dr. Usman Chauhan. Where do you see the future of cryptocurrencies, and how significant of a role do you think they will play in future geoeconomics?
That's a wonderful question. Professor Wang Wen, would you care to take the question pointed to you first?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the question. I'm not sure I get your key meaning of your question. I just understanding what's the future order. I think in terms of my imaginations, the future order should be equal, democratic, and mutual respect international order. First of all, I think United States should not be the global hegemony or the global leader. I think in the past 20 years, United States has no any capable or capacity to lead the world. The United States lead so many trouble, war, conflict to the world. So we should remind United States, you are not a leader. You cannot lead the world. You just respect the other countries equally, respectfully. I think this is very, very important. Remind it. And secondly is that I think for China, we don't want to be the next hegemony. Always we talking about this, not only in our annual government report or our party report. We always think China don't want to be the next superpower. I'm a consulting think tank scholar. I was invited by the China government ministries nearly about 100 times every year. I guarantee, share to the information to you. No any ministry, no any officials ask questions such as how China can be the superpower in the future, how China can design a strategy to be a next hegemony. No, we don't. We just want to push the equal mutual respect for international order, including a lot of framework. For example, the Bell Law Initiative or the common future of human beings, such an initiative. Third is that I think those regional powers, including, for example, India, Pakistan, or in France, UK, Germany, I think all of us should focus on our development domestically. We have to focus on solving our own problems. You know, nowadays, there are so many domestic problems happened in each countries, even including China. So our missions in the coming 5 years, in terms of our 20th Party Congress report, most of our energy focus on our solution of domestic issues. So I think in terms by solving the domestic issues, the international order should be better and better. So that's my answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Very well spoken. Dr. Una?
Thank you for the question. I just wanted to say that actually when it came to Ukraine, the first nations that reacted were the ones closest to Ukraine. It was the Baltics, it was Poland. If you remember, yes, the US indeed did put out the information before the attack that Russia's going to attack, but they were a little bit reluctant to provide expensive weaponry, etc., not being sure how this, so I have to push back against this point. Another thing that your question is actually, it makes sense because it is a bit of a debate that we've been having, and it has to do with EU strategic autonomy, right? It feeds into that. So, and indeed, in an ideal situation, the EU should be able to cater to its own security, not just EU, sorry, this was a Freudian slip, obviously, when I say EU, I mean the wider Europe should be able to cater to its own security. But currently, we are very far off, and the train doesn't wait. So we kind of take what we can get. But I want to make one very specific point. When it came to Russia's attack on Ukraine, it pulled countries together, not just the Western countries. You see, there were many countries that were affected by this and by the brutality of this. So this is not a US sitting cozy, as you put it, far away and watching and puppeteering, watching how it plays out. This is a joint effort. Thank you. There you go. Cooperation.
That's this cooperation in action. So, thank you very much. Very lucidly put. Now, there was one question about cryptocurrencies. It's an interesting one because the 21st century's economics will be different from the 20th century's. Cryptocurrency is a good example of that. Well, who owns cryptocurrencies? It's not a state necessarily. It's not private sector as we understand it. It's individuals. And they don't know each other because it's decentralized, it's semi-anonymous, and the ledger technology, the blockchain technology that underpins it means that we can almost have a geoeconomics outside of geoeconomics. So what I'd urge you when you think about cryptocurrencies is that they're counter narratives driven by civil society, where they don't want to bother with all of the tyrannies of the state executing themselves in politics and in economics. We can actually imagine different worlds. Now, I don't think necessarily that cryptocurrencies are the best solution for that, but it's certainly a voice articulating a different kind of world. All right, with this, geoeconomics was the topic today. look at economics as it is discussed normally. Nobody says they're a geoeconomics for a reason. Economics today is basically treated as a kind of applied mathematics. And you just do the numeracy and you think you get away with it, but many of the problems of societies cannot be captured by mathematics because they involve emotion, something brought up in session 1. But they also involve multiple, ambiguous, wicked problem, complexities that cannot be solved by any one person, any one state. They have to be taken in tandem. That's why economics actually has to go back. The original title in the time, the 1700s, when the Enlightenment was happening in Europe, they called it political economy. They were inextricable. Political economy was the only kind of economy. Then it became applied mathematics. And prior to the Enlightenment era in Europe, the Islamic polymaths used to treat economics as a branch of philosophy. And philosophy is probably the best way to approach geoeconomics and economics because it incorporates values, it incorporates history, and philosophy asks for a forward-looking approach, which includes technologies, geotechnomics, as Dr. Una coined the term. And so philosophy is probably the best way for us to that. And that's why I'm also grateful for Dr. Mueed Yusuf to complement the philosophical aspect with the practitioner element of his experience. And this is probably the next best step to proceed with how geoeconomics can work. But I would urge not just us, but all of the community of men to work together, and you can have a better world for the next generation. Thank you very much. With that, I conclude session 2 of GSTAR 2022.
Thank you to our members of the panel for their enlightening, nuanced, and rich discussion. I would now like to invite President Cass to present memento to our esteemed speaker. Thank you. I would now request President Cass, session moderator, and all the speakers for a group photograph. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of the second session. I thank the distinguished speakers and the esteemed audience for joining us. Kindly